Welcome back to the show. As always, I'm Chad Burdett, and my guest today is Tina Horn, and we're going to be discussing her comic DEPROG, which is a is from Dead Sky Publishing. Tina has is no stranger to comics. As a couple years ago, she did Safe Sex from Image. So let me bring her in. Let's find out more about her and the series.
Hello.
How's it going?
No stranger to comics, that's me.
So, before we get into talking about the book, tell me a little bit about yourself and your history as a comic book reader and, creator.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. So, I'm a lifelong comics fan since I was a little kid, and yeah, through my teen and college years and adulthood, probably always reading things that were a few levels up in appropriateness. So definitely reading a lot of, raw and underground comics. I think that you can see in my work a lot of what they say about comics warping your mind and making you twisted is unfortunately true in my case, and fortunately. And yeah, and so comics were one thing that I was a fan of that I had never professionalized, even though a lot of my work has been about pursuing pleasure and pursuing my interests as a journalist and nonfiction writer, as a podcaster myself, and as an educator, and also working in the sex industry. And then I got the opportunity in 2017 to write to pitch a comic, and I had this idea for a while for the sort of science fiction dystopian comic about, well, I had an idea for a story about a science fiction dystopian world where sexuality was even more repressed than it is now, where queers and sex workers and perverts are sort of the heroes. And when I got the opportunity to pitch a comic, I was like, maybe this idea I've had rattling around for a while will be the right fit. And so that became Safe Sex, or SFSX, as we sometimes abbreviate it. And that is out there's 2 volumes of that out from Image Comics with a wonderful team of artist collaborators. I myself am not a visual artist at all. I'm a writer and creator. And so that's one of my favorite things about comics, is the opportunity to collaborate with people who have talent and that I could never even dream of touching. And
Mhm.
and then one of my collaborators on Safe Sex, Steve Wands, the letterer,
Mhm.
who I loved working with, started this imprint called Dead Sky and wrote me, this was a couple years ago now, asking if I had any more strange and twisted ideas rattling around up here. And indeed I did. And so I feel so grateful that the collaborative element of comics can also lead to people doing their own projects. And if they like working with you or like your twisted mind, then you get more opportunities. I try to give people opportunities when I can as well. So I pitched Steve on this idea that became DEPROG, which has just come out in this first volume, September 2024, which is about a queer detective, very much in the tradition of hardboiled detective fiction, sort of neo-noir, who specializes in investigating and rescuing and deprogramming people from cults. So DEPROG is sort of an abbreviation of deprogram. And that's sort of Tate Debs, that's her method. And then I got the opportunity to work with Lisa Sturl, who I've admired for so long, and Gab Contras and Danny, who did so Gab did the colors for both Lisa's illustrations internally, and then also Danny's covers. I've admired Danny for so long, and getting the chance to collaborate with everyone on the team has been so incredible. And yeah, I love working with Steve and the whole team at Dead Sky, and it's been so wonderful to make. I mean, I love safe sex, and I want to write more in the safe sex series, but, and I apologize if you can hear my neighbor's dogs. There's a lot of
It's okay.
noisy dogs in the neighborhood. Yeah, one day I'll get my own soundproof studio, but until then, anyway, I was so happy to get the chance to write DEPROG because it was a chance to start totally fresh with a new idea and prove to myself that safe sex was not the only idea and the only series that I had in me. And I love the sort of sci-fi world of safe sex, and it was also fun to shift into a different genre and a slightly different tone and style of the sort of, like I said, neo-noir crime thriller, kind of highly stylized, and to just get into the world of cults and strange beliefs, and also weird Southern California hippie culture, and
Hmm.
the weirdness of the desert, and just all the wild real life things that are stranger than fiction, that that people believe in and make rituals around and do to each other.
So, kind of, I know you've kind of talked about, but were there any other influences that kind of led into the story of DPROG itself, other than just trying to integrate all those different genres?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I'm as long as I've been reading comics, I've also been reading hardboiled detective fiction. So I love the classics, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, obviously the movies that are inspired by that world. I love as well. And then some more contemporary, some stuff that's been written more contemporary, even if it takes place in a different time. So like Megan Abbott's Queen Pin really blew my mind when I read it, and just uh, reminded me that when you're making something in that world of crime thrillers and noir, that even if it's highly stylized, you just really have to be a sicko. And I was like, I could do that. Yeah, sick and twisted imagination, as I keep bringing up, I think is very crucial for this genre. And it's nice to pour it into fiction. And
Mhm.
then, I mean, in the comics world, I am a huge fan of John Constantine, both as the character, both in Alan Moore's original Swamp Thing series, and then also, years and years and years of Hellblazer, and all of the different places that Constantine pops up. And uh, it's so fun to, I feel like, as thinking about why I love Constantine so much was really helpful in writing Tate Debs, the protagonist of DEPROG, and creating that world, because you really got to think, okay, as a fan, why do I love this person who's such a terrible person who treats people so badly? um, and I mean, essentially it's the anti-hero, right? And
Mhm.
I think Constantine has been around, and being an anti-hero on the scale of demons and black magic, but also on a very human scale for decades. Um and so, it's fun to create characters who behave badly and say, but and maybe also just sometimes are super blunt and say the things that you maybe wish that you could say, but you're trying to be a good person, so you don't, and then you just put it in fiction. So fiction is a great outlet for, the shadow self, and especially when you make characters who are so shadowy themselves. And some other influences, I mean, really also in real life, I've spoken quite a lot about my fascination with cults. And I certainly have been following. I've been following all. Oh, and that's another thing that I want to shout out is Silver Sprocket made this amazing comics anthology called American Cults that I recommend because I love everything that Silver Sprocket does. But that's also such an incredible comics anthology because it feels like a horror thriller, but it's all based in fact. And you just get to see all, again, like all of the strange things that people believe and do to each other. So American Cult, I highly recommend. And just the real world of extreme beliefs and rituals. But then also, as I've mentioned, I moved from New York to Southern California about 5 years ago, and just being around both the way that, certain mushrooms, not even psilocybin, like psychedelic mushrooms, but just like reishi mushrooms are, someone in a marketing department will just decide this is good for your brain and then put it in a smoothie and charge you $17 for it. And, that's not new. It's not new to Southern California. It's not new to capitalism, but there is this particular style of it that I see around me and I'm from Northern California. So Lord knows I have seen a lot of that in the Bay Area and, even further north into the woods and mountains and canyons of NorCal. But there's this particular kind of like hippie hypocrisy that I kind of wanted to satirize with this book. And so working with Lisa Sturl and having all of those conversations, both about our fictional influences, but then all of that real life stuff also gave us the opportunity to just make a mood board, but also just make all of these lists of all of these little things that Lisa put into the background of, at one point, Tate goes into a hippie store in Venice, and there are just like all these little details in the background. And then some things that are just very dark and weird out in the deserts out here, and the way that the little worlds that people create and what they try to sell and how they try to sell it. So those are just some of the influences.
So, are there any other characters in the story besides Tate who you've kind of latched onto and would like to explore more?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, detectives only as interesting as their foils and their femme fatales and their sidekicks and the people that they shake down for information. Actually, that's a big cinematic influence for me is the Coens brothers, and the not only the just populating the world with weird little guys but also that sort of inherent cynicism that I feel like the Coens really play with in everything from Blood Simple to No Country for Old Men. And yeah, so Vera is the femme fatale of the story, and very classic, sachets, swishes into Tate's office, which is in the back of a video store. And we kind of tried to put in a little bit of that, like, DEPROG takes place kind of outside of time in a way that Lisa and I had a lot of fun with in terms of developing the aesthetics. And yeah, so Tate's office is in the back of a video store, and Vera walks in, this very va-va-voom, Jessica Rabbit, Hollywood sort of a look, but also is genderqueer and uses they them pronouns. So Vera is a bit inspired by queer people who I know who see femme as a maximalist gender and really wanted to play with that in this very maximalist and sometimes even campy genre, and also kind of maybe give a little bit of a modern take on a classic genre, and kind of have that the tension of contrasting those two things together. And maybe some readers will be familiar with femme using mx mix, instead of miss or Mrs. And using they them pronouns and talking about being a genderqueer femme and understanding the moon and all of that stuff. But that's just such an example of how, as a fiction writer, when you closely observe the characters in your life and the cultures in your own life, especially when you're part of various countercultures, then you just get to bring those into stories because that they're not represented enough. And so that's Vera. Vera is a very mysterious and horny character. So I think that Vera is a very, like, you may have met your match kind of a character for Tate. And there's a little bit of therapy speak that we're satirizing in this book as well. Like, Tate talking about how important boundaries are to her, as she like blatantly has really bad boundaries. And I, just off the top of my head, I just saw the Beetlejuice sequel, and I feel like the Justin Theroux character does something similar in that movie, of just kind of giving lip service to therapy speak while blatantly disregarding it. Anyway, Beetlejuice, always an influence on everything I do. How could he not be? And now I've said it twice, I'm not going to say it again. And then Les, who is Tate's sort of sidekick, who really wants to learn more about how to be involved in DEPROG, how to investigate cults, how to infiltrate cults. But Tate kind of keeps him around to, use the back room in the back of the video store that Les owns, and to use him as a driver, and to, use him in all of these different ways because of his enthusiasm. That's a bit of a deliberate gender reversal there, of having this sort of like secretary sidekick be a guy, and the detective to be a woman. And I'm trying to remember which book it was, but it might be Red Harvest. There's a book that with a line that always stuck out to me, where the detective says to his secretary, "You're a good man, sister." And I love sort of playing with gender in that way. And I feel like "You're a good man, sister" kind of encapsulates the detective side of the project of DEPROG, is the idea that if someone is competent, that someone would see them as masculine, and kind of trying to like play with that, and play with the idea of power and gender, and the different ways that can manifest and be explored and be exploited. So yeah, those are just some of and then I don't want to spoil too much, but as we get into, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that volume 1 of DEPROG, which is the first 4 issues, really fulfills the promise of the premise, which is investigating a strange cult and learning all of their weird ways. And many of the things that they do were also influenced by the time that I have spent in California hot springs and the hippie culture that has sprung up around these natural places that people have sort of like made structure around, and are selling like $17 reishi smoothies. And I love them, by the way, the smoothies and the hot springs, and would go any day. But you closely observe what you love, I think. And also that's kind of how I try to live my life, especially as a writer, is to ask myself, why do I like this, and what am I falling for, and am I willing to be a mark and fall for it, and what does this sort of mean structurally that these things get to exist, people get to hoard power and profit off of them. So these are just some of the things that influence DEPROG.
Did you have to do any research into, deprogramming, how people are deprogrammed from, cults?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually there's a really big influence. I'm so bad. I don't actually know the author's name off the top of my head, but I will look it up in a second. There was an article in Harper's Magazine probably about 10 years ago that was about a real life private investigator who infiltrated cults. And I have such a vivid memory of reading it because I've talked about this elsewhere, but my parents were Moonies. They met in this cult called the Unification Church. They had left by the time I was born, so I was not raised in a cult. And I actually didn't find this out until I was in my 20s. I didn't find out that my parents had met in a cult until I was in my 20s. And so even by the time I read that Harper's article, it was just kind of an aha moment of a lot of things coming together about ideologies, and just really my biggest takeaway from it was, if you think that a cult would never get you, then that's what they'd use to get you, if that makes sense. Sort of like very same thing psychologically as a con artist, right? Con artists use the same techniques that work on all different kinds of people, no matter what religion they are a part of or what they believe in, no matter what their class status is, no matter where they are in the world, their gender, these fundamental human needs for belonging and, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And sometimes even a sense of assurance that they can just quiet their busy, neurotic minds and, have someone tell them what to do. All of these different things, whether it's a cult or interpersonal abuse or the abuses of cults on a group think level, are so fascinating to me. And because I think of myself as somebody who is not easily indoctrinated, but that's the humility that I feel that I've learned from studying cults is understanding that. And so, Tate is not based on me, but I think that I did try to put some of my real life struggles with my cult origin story and sort of what that means about my relationship to power and sex and belief and spirituality and all kinds of different things. And so I did quite a lot of reading and, of course, endless streaming service documentaries. And, the Nexium cult, I feel like, is sort of the highest profile cult of the past 10 years.
I can think of another one, but
Are you talking about QAnon?
Trumpism, you know.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. Yes, a lot. I think that here's what I'll say about that. I think that everyone should spend, I recommend, I shouldn't say should because that's what cults do. I recommend that everyone, no matter who you are, spend a little bit of time studying cults and reading about cults. Just, read a book, nonfiction book, obviously. DEPROG. Lots and lots and lots of wacky fictional shit, and then quite from my twisted imagination and Lisa's and Gab and Danny's twisted pens, but definitely influenced by a lot of fundamentals of real life stuff that you can't make up, that people do and believe in. And I think that contemplating these things that I was just talking about how cults indoctrinate people, how they convert people, how they draw people in, how they keep them, how they treat people who try to leave, how they treat people who have left, and thinking about the parallels between that on massive group levels and smaller groups and relationship, two people in a relationship, will help you to understand the way that power works in a lot of different situations, whether it's electoral politics or ideological configurations of all kinds. And the writer Jonathan Lethem, who's one of my favorite nonfiction writers, wrote in a book, I'm pretty sure actually it's the book that he wrote about the Talking Heads record, Fear of Music. He talks about the fact that, which is a very paranoid record, and he said something in that book that has always stuck with me, which is that he recommends that people not use the term conspiracy theory, because a theory is actually, words mean things, and a theory is actually, you have a hypothesis, you look for proof. If the proof disproves your hypothesis, then you know that your hypothesis was not correct. And that's the scientific method, right? And even theory in the world of the more abstract philosophical, literary theory, queer theory, all of these political theory, all of these different things, it is based on, like, you can have an idea that you maybe just pluck out of thin air, but you're looking for things to support that instead of bringing a confirmation bias into trying to shoehorn reality into the idea that you want to be true because of your ego, you want to be right, or because you wish the world was like this. And then you get to the point where all evidence it is to the contrary, but you still believe this thing that is obviously not based in reality. So Lethem recommends talking about it in terms of conspiracy thinking, that it is a way of thinking, but it's not actually really theoretically, it's not based in the same things that we would bring to accepting that we might be wrong.
So, how, as we kind of wrap up here, how from your time writing safe sex to working on DEPROG, how have you grown as a writer? And do you have any advice that you would give yourself that you've learned since then that could have used writing safe sex?
What a great question. I love talking about learning and growing. Let me think for a second about how I've grown. I mean, while I was writing DEPROG, I was also simultaneously writing if I may,
Yeah,
another
sure.
book called, let me get it into the frame here, Why Are People Into That? A Cultural
Hmm.
Investigation of Kink, which is a nonfiction book published by Hachette, also came out in 2024 and available wherever books are sold. And that was definitely the most massive nonfiction undertaking that I have ever undertaken. And it was really, I think that working at that, having a new piece of fiction in the form of DEPROG while I was also writing this book, every chapter sort of an essay of cultural criticism. I think that those really supported each other. And I can think of a lot of methods that I learned while writing Safe Sex that I definitely brought to both Why Are People Into That? A Cultural Investigation of Kink and DEPROG, which, the most important one is outlining and structure and,
Hmm.
really figuring out what is going to happen in every issue before you start writing issue one, and
Hmm.
knowing what is going to happen on every page before you start writing page one, panel one. And that kind of outlining is such an important stage before you really just kind of get into like puking everything up onto the page. And so I think, how have I grown as a writer? I'm trying to think of like an example of something or a lesson that I
Maybe working
learned.
with the artist or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one thing that has changed that I feel so grateful for is that with a little bit of the way that Safe Sex got started, I ended up working with several different artists over the course of the series. And that felt natural to me. I mean, as I mentioned before, I grew up on comics, and, some of the biggest influences on me were early Vertigo titles. I mean, I've already mentioned Hellblazer, but, certainly so much of Grant Morrison's work, and the Invisibles, and the Invisibles would have totally different artists from issue to
Hmm.
issue, and that felt, or from volume to volume, and that felt very natural to me. But to and Safe Sex is such a personal story to me because it really is about like putting a lot of allegories of sexual politics like into a fun, I hope for readers, action adventure. And with DEPROG being able to be co-creators with Lisa Sturl right from the beginning, and for this to be our book and our project, and to have, to get on the phone, because we actually are about to meet in real life for the first time, in the flesh. We've had countless phone calls and Zoom calls over the past few years, Lisa and I, but we're about to meet up in person at Comics Crossroad Columbus later this month, September 2024. So that's going to be really fun and exciting. But to just be able to spend so much time communicating virtually about, yeah, things like the time period and anachronisms, and things like aesthetics, and things like, I was talking about a scene set in that I wanted to set in a motel in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and Lisa brought up Paris, Texas, and I was like, yes, we're having a mind meld, this is so great. And then exchanging whether it's pictures of people at a BDSM club, there's a joke about sort of a little bit of a loving satire of the Jamie Lee Curtis idea of horror as being about trauma. And, we have a BDSM party in issue 1 that is called Trauma. And then Lisa was actually able to find, I just made that up. I was like, yeah, no, that could totally be a thing. And then Lisa was like, oh no, I actually think I remember Club Trauma. Then found a bunch of pictures. And so, being able to bring in real life aesthetic influences and stylistic influences and tone and to just be able to jam with someone was so valuable, and definitely how I always want to work in the future.
So, is there now the collected edition comes out December 3rd, I believe, of DEPROG. Would I read that right?
There's been a few different, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a few dates floating around on the internet, but I believe the most recent one, which we are now coming up on, is September 24th, 2024.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
but regardless of when it is out, I can say for sure that it's available to pre-order wherever books and comic books are sold right now. Mm-hmm. And I can say for sure that I will always recommend that you contact your local comic book store, your local indie bookstore, let them know that you're interested in DEPROG, yes. Let them know that you are interested in, everybody on this art team, that you're interested in, in comics with queer characters and themes, mm-hmm. written by queer people. Sadly, it still needs to be said also, like giving comic book stores the message that you want to vote with your dollars and being interested in writers who are women and, definitely. Stories that have protagonists that are women. I don't want people to only be interested in my work to virtue signal, but I do think that we have to be mindful of the ways that women are still marginalized in the comic book world and the genre fiction world and checks notes the world in general. So letting people and there's all these QAnon types that want to keep us down. So unfortunately a little bit of overlap with that sometimes in the loudest part of the fandom community, but I know that the people who are watching this are the good ones and the people who are the kinds of fans who are interested in great stories and great art and and supporting marginalized voices because we're great at what we do.
And at Comic Watch, we are very proud of our liberal comics agenda.
Absolutely. I support this. Sign me up.
So, is DEPROG going to be hopefully an ongoing, or do you have an ultimate kind of finish for the story? Or you can't say.
I very much hope that I get to continue writing DEPROG and writing in the world of DEPROG and Tate Debs and working with this wonderful art team and working with this wonderful publisher. And so if you're listening to this or watching this and you want to see more, then the thing that you can do is buy the book, let your local comic book and bookstore know that you're interested in it so that they know that there's interest, posting about it, telling your friends, posting, getting in the comics, getting in the comments about the comics, getting in the comics, out of the comment section and into the comic book stores. That's what I say. And the thing that was fun about writing a procedural is that the genre has conventions that I could draw from to complete this story arc in this book, while leaving it open that there could be more mysteries, more characters, more adventures in this world. So, not going to spoil anything that happens, who gets out alive, but that was part of how I knew that DEPROG was a good idea for a comic, is that it has this kind of engine where every new series could have another cult as the big bad. But at the same time, there is this, and this is not spoiling too much to say, it's sort of in the premise that Tate was raised in a cult and comes from a cult and is somewhat haunted by the trauma of that cult. So the idea that there's kind of a mystery about the leader of that cult and the former followers or current followers or maybe revival followers of that cult that she was raised in continues to make it personal. So I suppose the last thing I'll say is that that's another huge influence, even structurally, in terms of how I think about these things, is being a teenager in the 90s and being obsessed with the X-Files, right? You've got Monsters of the Week and you've got mythology, right? So even as you might get engrossed in some gross new monster or new mystery every week, or maybe for a few episodes or even over the course of a season, there's always this deeply personal question about alien abduction that sometimes comes into the one-off sort of bottle episodes and then sometimes will get focused on for a little bit of an arc and get woven together. So just out here trying to be as much like Mulder and Scully as possible every day.
Well, if you want to give one last pitch for the book and any other projects that you have going on and where people can find you on social media, then now's that time.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for having me. So DEPROG Volume 1 is available for pre-order or ordering, depending on when you are listening to this, at your indie comic book store and bookstore, because it is a trade. And I hope people will check it out and let me know what you think. I'm most active on Instagram these days. I am still on X. And my handle on both
Twitter.
of those places. Thank you.
We don't call it X here.
Thank you. Twitter. Not like I am particularly fond of or loyal to the little bluebird either, but what a world. Anyway, I'm on there at TINAHORNSASS. That's Tina Horn Sass, or Tina Horn's Ass if you're nasty. And then my other new book that is out this year, 2024, is Why Are People Into That? A Cultural Investigation of Kink. If you are at all interested in the world of weird and twisted sexuality, in the real nonfiction world, and also want to learn. It's not a memoir, but there's definitely a lot of personal essay stuff and drawing from my experiences as a professional dominatrix and pornographer. So if you want to check that out, it's both a fun and informative read and way to scandalize people on the subway or the beach or wherever, or to just sort of read privately. And let's see, if you go to my website tinahorn.net, that's TINAHORN.net, you can subscribe to my newsletter and just get updates on whatever, articles I write for Rolling Stone and various other, political and cultural and literary magazines or online magazines. And I teach a lot of workshops on sort of the real life world of kink. So if you are interested in a workshop, I'm always posting the updates on tinahorn.net and sending out very simple and usually about once a month emails to my newsletter on that. And I do personal coaching as well and consulting for people's artistic projects. I've consulted for theater and film and people's books of all kinds. So if you're interested in that work, tinahorn.net is the place to find out more about that. And I think that's most of what I've got going on. I do have a podcast, Why Are People Into That the book is based on, and it's been on a bit of a hiatus while I wrote the book, but it's been out. It came out in early summer, and now that we're getting into fall, sort of figuring out what's next. Maybe another DEPROG, maybe another safe sex, maybe firing up the podcast again. Just gotta figure out where the money's at and where my passions are at and where those things intersect. So yeah, that's me.
Well, I enjoyed our chat, and if whenever you have another comic book project that you would like to talk about, I would love to, come back and chat, and we can chat more about anything else.
We can chat.
What was that?
Oh, we can chat.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, and check out DEPROG. Go to your like was said, go to your local comic book stores or bookstore and support them. And have a good rest of the day. And thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Chad, and thanks to the
All right.
listeners / watchers.
All right. Catch you later.